speaker, Scott Horton. Scott needs your help. Scott needs our support. Scott needs our support, not just tonight. Scott needs our support, not just tonight, not just here, but this energy needs to carry over tomorrow, because tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning, he's going to have a very civil, very cordial conversation. I'm not kidding, he is, with former chairman of the Libertarian Party, Nicholas Sarwark. That event is at breakfast tomorrow at about 7:30. I know it's early. Make sure you party harder tomorrow night than you do tonight. Get up for breakfast. Give Scott a cheering section. Let's give him some support. Let's show him some support right now for his speech. Scott Horton.
Wow. Jeez, guys. I should have written some jokes or something. Dave is on after me, so be patient. Oh, man. Yeah. Wow. So, first of all, thank you to Michael Heiss and to Preston, everybody, for having me out here tonight. I really appreciate that a lot. I'm very grateful. And also, I'm sorry I don't remember everybody's name from a couple of years ago when you guys had me out and I gave a talk, and it was my big break because I was on C-SPAN 2 talking about my Afghanistan book. So that was a big deal for me. And in fact, I got away with saying 2 cuss words on C-SPAN. They ran it anyway. It's part of the documentary record. They can't edit it, you know? All right. The rest of the speech is not going to be fun. Okay, that was the last line that was in it. We're going to talk about the Israel-Palestine crisis that's going on right now. Oh, by the way, some of y'all probably have no idea who I am and are wondering why all these people are yelling. I'm the guy from antiwar.com and from the Libertarian Institute. And I got a new book called Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I really wish I had sent a few hundred in advance to meet me here to sell to you guys, but I do have a couple of dozen upstairs, so I'll have a few available for you guys at the end. All right, so now the bad news. All right. People are being killed right now, as you all know, in the Gaza Strip and in Israel as well, in the fighting between the Israeli government and Hamas. And I looked at antiwar.com about an hour ago, and it was 100 and something killed, including, I believe it was 37 children, and that's...
Children are up to 30 years old. That's how they count.
Whatever, lady. All right. So we have our Zionist heckler in the audience before we even begin. Okay, and she's leaving, so now we can do the talk. And if any other people who disagree with me are welcome to, but it'd probably be better if you don't just talk throughout my talk, and then maybe we'll do questions and answers at the end if you really want something like that. Maybe I'll change somebody's mind. So. I need to take some lessons from Dave on dealing with hecklers, you know? What do I know about it? No, anyone up to 30 is a child, said the lady. Yeah, anyway. So more than 30 children have been killed, and more than 100 people overall, and that's virtually all on the Palestinian side. There have been casualties on the Israeli side as well. I believe it was less than 5, the last that I saw, but it did include at least 1 child as well on the Israeli side. And so the problem with this is that Americans, most of us get our news from TV. And on TV, they never explain. They never say, here's who's who, here's who's occupying who, here's a little bit of background about what's going on. They always act like history began yesterday. And you know what happened was some rockets came over the wall, and what would you do? You'd defend yourself too, wouldn't you? But that's showing up in the middle of a fist fight and pretending really, on the part of most Americans, pretending you know who threw the first punch when really you don't. You're just going along with what they say. And then even worse than that is you have partisanship, which is the ultimate mind killer. And so people say, well, if leftists side with the Palestinians, then I side with the Israelis. Well, if Ted Cruz and Donald Trump are standing with Netanyahu, then I must be on the side of the Palestinians. And this is, you know, it's a shortcut, and it's a really lousy way to get to a conclusion. You know, the truth is not partisan. It is what it is. And all of us over the age of 18 ought to be able to look at this dispassionately as we can and try to really find the truth for ourselves, not just rely on other people. And what we have here really is a severe case of what the great libertarian economist and historian Robert Higgs calls truncating the antecedents. And that he was talking about World War II. That's skipping the part about how we got here. Japan attacked us, and now Roosevelt is leading our defense. But we don't need to know anything about what caused the run-up to the war. Truncating the antecedents. It's the same thing here. And so I tend to do the opposite. I tend to over-explain. Some of you may know. How much time do I have up here today? Who's got a stopwatch? All right. That's right. I do have to be up in the morning, so that'll be y'all saving grace. I got to get out of here at some point. Listen, so I'm going to go back to 48, okay? And I'll try to do this fast. I don't want to belabor the point and lose your interest here. But when the state of Israel was created, they purged 750,000 Palestinians from the land, what they call ethnic cleansing, Muslims and Christians. And that's about the population of Austin, Texas. That's nothing to sneeze at, 750,000 people. And they wouldn't let them return from their homes after the fighting. And they wouldn't let them have their own independent state at the time. They made a secret deal with the king of Jordan that he would occupy the West Bank. And I'm not exactly sure when, but fairly soon Egypt got control of the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians never got their state. Many of them fled to refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, in Kuwait, and all over the Middle East, and then, of course, into Gaza and in the West Bank. In fact, the population in Gaza right now, 80% of them are refugees, descendants and actual living refugees and descendants of refugees from other parts of what we now call Israel. Well, that worked for the Israelis in the sense that they now had an 80-20 super duper majority vote. So they could call it a Jewish democracy, and with a straight face. And there, 20% of the population there are what are called Israeli Arabs, or Palestinian citizens of Israel is the new, more politically correct term for them. And they essentially are treated like second-class citizens, but they do have citizenship. And they do have some representation in the Knesset, although the ruling coalition will never allow them to be part of the ruling coalition. Any Israeli Jewish political party would rather not take power than join in a coalition with the Arab parties in order to gain a majority and take the seat. That's been the tradition all along. So it is what it is. Then in 1967, Israel attacked Egypt. And then Jordan and Syria also jumped in what's called the Six-Day War. You might remember the Israelis attacked and sank the USS Liberty in the middle of that. Oh, yeah. Must not have. Again, watching TV to get all your history right. And so in the Six-Day War, the Israelis took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And now the Palestinians didn't have anything to do with this. They're just the innocent bystanders in the middle, essentially. They had no sovereignty over the king of Jordan or Nasser's dictatorship in Egypt, of course. And so what happened was they just lost. And as some say, hey, the victors go the spoils, right? Except that's not the law. See, what happened was Hitler ruined that for would-be imperialists for all times with his Lebensraum policy in Eastern Europe. And after World War II, the United States of America and our allies outlawed nations invading other nations and conquering their territory and expanding their populations into their territory. Imagine if George W. Bush had tried to transfer a bunch of white Christians from Texas to occupy Baghdad and cleanse the city and take it over and make it a white Christian city. That's obviously would be purely a war crime under federal law and every bit of international law, all the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter, which I'm not a big fan of the UN, but the Charter is a treaty ratified by the US Senate, and at least where it binds the US government's power, I appreciate that most of the time. But anyway, so the Palestinians then, another 250, 300,000 were cleansed from their land in 67. But they still kept millions. They took the land, but they weren't able to purge all the people. But that was 54 years ago. And all the Palestinians living under the occupation in the West Bank, which they always separate out, East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem was taken in 48. And East Jerusalem is essentially on the West Bank. It's part of the West Bank. And the rest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has been under the military control of Israel all along. The Palestinians were beaten 54 years ago, right? So, but if you turn on Fox News, they say, Palestine is attacking. The Palestinians are attacking. And they phrase it in a way where you might think that Palestine is the sovereign nation next door to Israel. They've now started a war. They're attacking Israel. But that's not right. They'll say, I saw this one on Twitter a couple of times this week, they say, well, what would we do if the Mexicans, right, and you're to take that to mean the Mexican sovereign nation state government, if the Mexicans started firing rockets over the border into Texas? But that analogy is inapt. An apt analogy would be if we were still constantly persecuting and harassing and bombing and killing the Navajo on the reservation out in Arizona and continually confiscating more and more land like the Indian Wars never ended and left them on a smaller and smaller little bit of a little Bantustan of a stateless territory surrounded by 40-foot concrete walls. And then they started firing rockets over that. Well, that's a little bit different, isn't it? It's, in fact, entirely different. And the mantra on TV and on NPR and from the Democratic White House is Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. But actually, legally, that is not true. They are not defending themselves. They're the occupying power. It is the occupied who, under international law, have the right to defend themselves. And this really matters not just because fair is fair and justice is justice, but this affects us in the United States of America to a very great degree. And I'll just give you one example. In 1996, when Shimon Peres's government reinvaded southern Lebanon to attack Hezbollah in what they called Operation Grapes of Wrath, that day, a young Egyptian engineering student studying in Hamburg, Germany, signed his last will and testament, which was essentially like a metaphor for joining the army, signing up in the cause to fight against the Israeli side there. And his name was Mohammed Atta. And just a few months after that, Osama bin Laden put out his first declaration of war against the United States. And in that, he talked on and on about the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon, and especially what's now called the first Qana massacre, because they did it again 10 years later, when the Israelis bombed a United Nations shelter and killed 108 women and children. And bin Laden went off in the declaration of war and was very specific. We'll never forget the severed arms and heads of the babies and this kind of thing. So then Mohammed Atta and his friend Ramzi bin al-Shibh went to Afghanistan and joined al-Qaeda. And Ramzi bin al-Shibh is in Guantanamo Bay right now for helping coordinate the September 11th attack. Mohammed Atta, of course, was the ringleader hijacker in the United States, crashed Flight 11 into the North Tower. Or was it the South Tower? I forget which one. And that was why it is. Egyptian engineering students studying in Hamburg, Germany, crashed planes, our planes, into our towers in revenge for what Israel was doing in Lebanon. Because every bit of what Israel does in Palestine, or at that time in their permanent, almost 20-year-long war in Lebanon, is at the American people's expense, with our weapons, our money, and most importantly of all, our government's diplomatic support and ultimate ruling veto power on the UN Security Council to aid and abet every bit of this. And listen, that sure as hell does not mean that any American civilian deserved to die in that attack, or that, as a cynic would try to phrase it, that I'm justifying or rationalizing that. It's not an excuse, it's a reason. It's the true history of the world. It's the motivation behind, a major part of the motivation for Al-Qaeda's war against the United States has always been American support, not for Israel being a nice Jewish boy minding its own business over there and being our good friend, but for their ruthless tyranny over the people of Palestine and of Lebanon. It has been that way, and it still is. It's important to note, too, and people sometimes oversimplify this and overstate it and say that, well, Israel created Hamas. Not exactly. It was Sheikh Yassin and his people in the Gaza Strip who created Hamas. But the Israelis had a deliberate program at the time, as they have admitted. Their intelligence officers in charge at the time have talked about this on the record now. They had an official policy of allowing Hamas to thrive while they were ruthlessly repressing and oppressing everyone else. They'd do a big sweep, round up all of Yasser Arafat's PLO guys, and let the Hamas guys go, and in fact even gave them money to help establish them. They started out really as a charity, education and food for the poor and this kind of thing. But as they built their power, the Israelis saw the advantage in building them up into a separate armed force, divide and conquer, a right-wing religious alternative to the secular commie PLO. And it'll help divide the Palestinians and make them easier to rule, which has been exactly the case all along. And of course, there's some people, if the lady had stayed, she'd have screamed at me that I love Hamas, I'm on the side of Hamas, right? Which is great public relations for Israel. That how could you side with the Palestinians when they're represented by this armed right-wing radical religious faction? Only in part they are, and that's already skipping way ahead into the story. They were already occupied for 20 years, 10, 15 years before the Israelis even started to abet the rise of Hamas in the first place. And it's also important to note that when Hamas won the election of 2006, which Condoleezza Rice forced them to hold, and by the way, the Israelis essentially, and I don't know that this was on purpose, I guess it could have been, but they really were cracking down on the PLO, or the PLA faction at the time, and prevent, the Israelis collect all the taxes, and they were refusing to give the tax money to Fatah so they could buy up their votes with their patronage. And so that tilted the balance in favor of Hamas. Hamas won the election, but just barely, and it was a coalition. They had to form a coalition government, essentially. Well, that goes against the whole divide and conquer thing. We don't want that. So what happened was Elliot Abrams in the Bush White House worked with the Israelis and the Egyptians to attempt a coup. And they put a bunch of weapons into the Gaza Strip to give to Yasser Arafat's side to try to attack Hamas and kill them and take over the Gaza Strip. But it backfired, and Hamas got wind of it and attacked them first and won, and that's what ended the coalition. And it was only then, after the election the Americans forced them to hold, and after the failed coup that the Americans attempted, only then did Hamas become the real rulers of the Gaza Strip. But even then, not the real rulers, right? They're the trustees in an Israeli prison. They're really, and unlike, I guess, the PLA in the West Bank, they're not really under, they don't act as agents for the Israelis the way the PLA does, but they are de facto still just the biggest gang in a stateless land with, no real government. And by the way, even if you do believe, like Osama bin Laden and the American government and the Israeli government in collective guilt, In 2006, at the time that election was held, the majority of the people of the Gaza Strip were what we call minors. They weren't minors. They were the majority, under 18, unable to vote. And that was 15 years ago. And they are somehow to be held ever responsible. And even today, it's a 50-50 split, something in the population there. Half of them are under 18 years old. Under 30. Okay, and now, really importantly, in very recent history, before the recent violence broke out, Bet Salem, which is the most important human rights organization in Israel, issued a devastating report accusing their government of instituting an apartheid regime over the people of Palestine. And that was followed just 2 weeks ago by Human Rights Watch, the most important human rights organization in the world, which it's true they do sometimes spin for the State Department and help lie us into war and should always be taken with a grain of salt. In this case, they're not ginning up a fake case. This is them finally admitting, after all these years, this is them facing up to the unface-up-toable, right? That the two-state solution that they've been pretending that they're going to someday implement for the last 25 years, that ruse is over, right? Especially in America. American Jewish Zionists mostly are liberals, and they really can't countenance the treatment of the Palestinians. And they have a real problem, but they've been told, as we've all been told, don't worry, it's a peace process, and we're gonna have a two-state solution. Eventually, there will be independence for the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But now those days are over. Nobody believes that anymore because the Israelis have illegally colonized virtually the entire place. They now have what were called in South Africa Bantustans, tiny little isolated neighborhoods with Jewish-only roads and walls and all these things separating them from each other. And so in order to remove the Israeli Jewish settlers on the West Bank for it to be a Palestinian state, that would cause a civil war in Israel among Israeli Jews over that level of an effort to remove those people by force now. There are millions of them there. It's too late. There will never be a separate independent Palestinian state on the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip. As somebody compared it to two sides negotiating over a pizza while one side is eating it. And now there's nothing but the crust left. And now you can't pretend that this is a meal at all. They can't have it, to carry the analogy through clumsily there. And so now that's why you see even critics in Congress who wouldn't have dared before, and you see Human Rights Watch who wouldn't have dared before, saying, listen, if it really is one state from the river to the sea, then these people must have equal rights. If you're not going to give them independence, you have to give them citizenship. It can't go on like this. And when Jimmy Carter, the people don't like him as a president, but you gotta admit he's a kind old man. He wrote a book called Peace, Not Apartheid. And they said, vicious anti-Semite. Jimmy Carter? The guy that did the Camp David Accord because of how much he cared for Israel? Come on. But then Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, and former defense minister said, geez, if we don't let the West Bank and Gaza Strip go, we're going to have an apartheid situation. And then the last prime minister before Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert, said the same thing. And so what that means is that right now, we do have one state. It is one state. But fully half the people have no rights. No representation in the government. I talked about the Israeli-Arab faction. That's about 10% of the Palestinians in total, I think, have some representation in the Knesset and third-class citizenship or second-class citizenship inside Israel. But all of the rest of them have no rights whatsoever, and all of the Palestinians languishing in the refugee camps in Syria and in Jordan still have no right to come home. And the situation is completely untenable now. And so that leads us to what's happening in the current crisis. Under the color of law, the Israeli courts have ruled that the Israeli Jewish government of West Jerusalem can ethnically cleanse this neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. And it's literally, watch the scenes. You can find the videos. You don't have to rely on Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, and Tom Brokaw to show you anymore. You can find it on YouTube, find it on Twitter, and look and see these Israeli settlers moving right in and throwing these people right out of their homes, throwing their furniture in the street, saying, it's my house now. And in fact, there's one where the guy is clearly from Brooklyn, New York. And she's saying, Jacob, it's my house. You can't steal it. And he says, oh, come on. If I didn't steal it, someone else would. So it makes no difference. And she says, no, no one can steal it. And you know, I read the backstory on that. Jacob's family from Brooklyn, they have the right of return. Palestinians who actually are from there don't. But Jacob from Brooklyn, him and his family actually stole and occupied half of this family's house back in 2009. They literally, like while they were gone at work, they moved into half the house, threw up some wallboard, and said, this half of the house is ours now. And you couldn't make this stuff up. Now they've taken the rest of the house. And they're doing this, and they're cleansing this neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah. And that was what was leading to massive protests. And then there were, you know, extreme right-wing religious Jews of one sector or another who were marching, chanting death to the Arabs. And then last Friday night was the last day of Ramadan. And there were big, you know, a huge assembly at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and prayers. And then the Israeli security forces came and attacked them with flashbang grenades and smoke bombs and truncheons and caused a riot. Of course, the Palestinians throw stones back and this kind of thing. And then on last Monday, they attacked again. And you can watch the videos. Again, you can see it all on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Wherever you look, you can see where it's just civilians in there praying, and the Israeli Defense Forces come in, throwing flashbang grenades at them and tear gas grenades and shooting them with rubber bullets, and 300 people were wounded. And then that afternoon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip warned the Israeli government, if you guys don't back off of the Al-Aqsa Mosque by sundown or whatever the time limit was, then we will fire rockets. Is that the story they told you on TV? That they were ethnically cleansing this neighborhood, and that the cops rioted on these people as they were praying on the last day of their holy holiday, and that Hamas gave them fair warning, and that they were the aggressors. Now instead, oh no, it's rockets. What would you do if someone was shooting rockets at you? And it's just a narrative. It's Hasbara, as they call it. It's just Israeli for spin, trying to explain their government's behavior to the rest of the world. And always it's soaked through with dishonesty because what they're doing is wrong. It's as simple as that. And so yeah, just to reiterate, you know, what's happening in Gaza with more than 100 killed, more than 30 children killed so far, they'll try to have their cake and eat it too, and all of a sudden pretend that we're being attacked by the Palestinians, as though that means, the way we would say the Americans or the Israelis when we talk about the government of America or the government of Israel. But there is no government of Palestine. They are occupied. And that entire narrative is essentially just trying to turn the truth on its head and the aggressors into the defenders to confuse you, because that's the only chance they have. And by the way, Joe Biden, for those who say, oh, this is what leftists believe and all good right-wingers and capitalists and whoever, I don't know, patriotic Americans know that we're supposed to support Israel. Well, Joe Biden does whatever Benjamin Netanyahu says. Joe Biden says this is just fine. And I swear to God, everybody, even if you got to do it now and stop listening to me, look up Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, trying to spin this week with Matt Lee, the heroic reporter from the Associated Press, trying to nail him down and say, do the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? We condemn the violence against the Israelis by Hamas. Well, do you condemn the killing of children by Israel? Oh, hem ha, hem ha, hem ha. He can't say it. He's not allowed to say it. That they condemn the killing of children. Oh, he'll be fired by the Democrats. So, might as well still be Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo up there as far as that goes. And so listen, just as a short note here, I did a bunch of interviews on the show yesterday. For people who want more and better background on this, I interviewed the great Philip Weiss from mondoweiss.net. Ramzi Baroud, who is a Palestinian refugee, an American citizen, and great intellectual and author. And Alan McLeod is a great reporter from Mint Press News who's been keeping track of just the insane twisting of language that the American media, you know how they do with a cop's gun discharged in an officer-involved shooting and a man died after that, or you know, that kind of thing. And they absolutely do the same thing here, where Israelis are killed, Palestinians just die after something happened near them somehow, and this kind of thing. And in fact, the New York Post just absolutely turned it around and said Hamas kills 26, including 9 children, in their attacks on Israel. Well, that was just 100% false. It was exactly the other way around with the Israeli attacks on the Palestinians. And they just outright lie about it. And then, of course, Max Blumenthal, who is the author of the book Goliath and the 51-Day War, about the war of 2014, the slaughter, the canned hunt of 2014. And boy, does he do some heavy lifting and some educating in that one, so you guys will want to hear that. And I would just close with, you know, the libertarian position should be the position for all Americans, liberal, conservative, or the rest of it, and you know, town and country and flyover country and the coasts and the cities and all races and all of that. Enough of this American empire. The policy of dominance. I mean, as we can all see, as we've all lived through for the last 20 years, and for those paying attention before that too, you can't have a limited constitutional world empire. It just doesn't work. You can't have it both ways. And so just because we can afford it, we can't. Just because they can make it seem like we can afford it for a while doesn't mean that we're supposed to just take advantage and get away with what we can get away with. Let the English have their empire if they think they can have one. Our proud heritage was revolution and secession from that evil empire. And there's so many evils in the world that are, in a sense, the people of this country's responsibility, because it's our government that we do have some control over, some influence over, that not only does so many horrible things, but supports so many cruel regimes around the world, just like the Israeli one. But and same for the tyranny in Egypt, the police state in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, and all over the world. America supports, especially in the Middle East, America supports these tyrannies. And you know, the very first step is to just stop intervening altogether. And the truth is, you know, there's a movement on right now called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions against Israel. Well, I'm against sanctions. I'm not for that. But I am for boycotting and divesting from Israel and from companies who do business with them and the rest of that. Something has to be done. You know, I don't want to stand up here and justify people shooting rockets at anyone. As I said at the beginning, innocent Israeli civilians have been killed in this thing. At the same time, though, what are the Palestinians supposed to do? Just lay down and die? They have no other recourse. They try to peacefully protest, they get the sniper bullet, okay? The Israelis just take and take and take. And then when they try to boycott, they say, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Well, look, you know what? It's not. It's peaceful dissent, peaceful protest. And nobody thinks that Israel, the nation state and their economy is going to become devoid of capital investment in their country and will lose their ability to produce and provide for their people, right? The problem is public relations. Why would anybody want to boycott Israel? Well, therein hangs a tale, right? So they don't want that story told. And so that's why they oppose it and attack it. But that's the best thing that we can do is, first of all, insist that our government stay the hell out of that and stop taking the Israeli side. They wouldn't be able to get away with any of this without American support. Most of it would resolve itself probably almost immediately after that. And then as regular people of our society and of our community, we can participate in boycotting them and helping spread the word and explaining to people why it is that it's so important that we do this, because these people are suffering, and at this point, they have no way out. Something must be done. Thank you.